Professor, good to see you today. Thank you for coming.
Very nice to see you. Thank you for the opportunity, Jay.
So perhaps you can tell us a few words about yourself and what your background is as an economist.
My name is Alexandre Skiba, and I was born in Ukraine, 1977. So I was made in the USSR. I moved to the United States in 1999 to go to graduate school at Purdue University. And long story short, now I am a PhD economist and the chair of the Economics Department at the University of Wyoming. My research is primarily on international trade and quantitative economics.
That's fantastic. So you're looking at the world's markets today. You're looking at specifically, let's say, what's going on in Russia. And there's been a lot of turmoil recently. How do you interpret what's going on? What do you see what's going on with the ruble? What do you see what's going on with trade? What's happening with Russia?
I think the short answer is that what we're observing are the consequences of the actions of the government, irrational actions of the government to invade a neighboring country. And I think that that decision has real consequences through many channels. One big one is the Western sanctions. Another one is the actual cost of the war. And I think another big, and I think potentially long-term, the largest consequence is the loss of the trust in the government's decision-making. And that has huge consequences for Russia going forward in terms of trust in the markets, trust in the interest rates, trusts in the monetary policy due to military invasion war on a neighboring country.
And what do you make, though, specifically? You've seen that the inflation seems to be increasing quite a bit for the ruble. It's gone up from about 60 to the dollar to the euro. Sorry, about a month ago. Today, it's looking at about 74-ish. How do you interpret that? What's going on?
There are two things that we need to separate: inflation and the depreciation of ruble. Inflation is the increase in the prices in Russia. I suspect that the headline inflation, which is the probably understating the true problem. And part of the reason is that first, the ruble is depreciating. So which means that with the same amount of rubles, now you can afford fewer dollars, which is the price or the currency in which you have to pay for most of the imports. So that will trickle, even though today they might be selling out the stock of the inventory, that increase in price will eventually get large. The second thing I think that why I think inflation is lower. So first of all, it's big and it's a huge problem, but I think that inflation is low. The actual inflation is higher, or the headline inflation is lower, is because a big chunk of the inflation in most economies, I don't know the details of the Russian economy, by the way, I apologize for that, is the expenses on the housing. Like in the United States, that's 35 to 40%. Now, the houses are not being bought and sold. And if anything, the value of housing in Russia right now might be declining. So that part of inflation being low or even getting lower, because I don't know, do you want to buy a house in Russia? I'll hold off, and so because of that, and that's where a lot of that inflation in terms of housing expenditure is tied into, plus heavily subsidized and controlled prices of energy. I think if you actually separated out the goods that consumers actually buy, I bet that inflation number is much higher. But I haven't verified it for myself.
So if you look at the Russian economy, how sick of an economy is it, or how healthy is the Russian economy at this point?
I think you read a lot that Western economists are surprised by the lack of immediate negative impact of sanctions. I honestly think that is a sign of, I don't think it's a good sign. The reason for that is that you can patch a lot of problems with immediate, quick solutions that lead to dramatic long-term effects. When I teach my principles of economics course, I always tell students, I can solve unemployment in a day. Easy.
How so?
You just print a lot of money, offer everybody $100,000 annual salary, and just hire everybody, right?
Right, right.
There's obviously, this is an extreme example, obviously, uh, but a lot of what Russia is doing is very similar. So, for example, you see a lot of restrictions that Russian government is imposing on the Russian economy. For example, you can't sell, or there are heavy restrictions on selling equities. There are restrictions on the on movements of capital. There are restrictions on, I mean, as we're learning now, there are proposed restrictions by the central bank on withdrawals of cash. And all of that signals is that Russia is trying to hide or mitigate the consequences of the strain on the economy that's coming from all parts. Now, the problem with the mitigation in this way is that sometimes it's justified if you have temporary shocks. For example, United States during Y2K also did a temporary thing. You know, banks have increased their cash holdings. So when people were very concerned that the computers are going to go crazy when the numbers go from 1999 to 2000, people withdrew cash. Nothing happened. They put it right back, and it was a temporary fix to remedy the panic that everybody knew is not going to happen, doesn't have any fundamental reason. Now, Russian economy has a fundamental reason to worry about. They cannot import the goods that they need. The foreign direct investments, which besides immediate short-term employment and salaries and tax benefits, also have long-term implications for the transfer of capital and other what we call external economies that they can create for the businesses around them. Somebody who works in McDonald's might have learned some management techniques and then worked at a local company. So flight of skilled, perhaps the most skilled labor force, decrease in the most skilled labor force, dissemination of trust in the decision making by the government. I mentioned that before because I think this is a huge part that they will take a long time to unwind. The key to remember here also is that so first of all, to sum up, Russia has these short-term problems that are huge. It's trying to patch it up. Those patches are very reasonable. The patches are something that other governments would have done, and they would have worked, except there is a fundamental difference that is going to catch up with you, and all those patches will only turn out to be more costly. The problem with the fundamentals is that if the actual, think about the bubbles in the stock market, the tulip bubbles,
right?
The famous tulip bubble. There was a difference between what's happening in the market and what's happening to the fundamentals. Typically, when we observe a bubble, we see economy chugging along, and then the prices are just exploding. Think about housing bubble, think about high tech bubble, right? So you see fundamentals increasing, but the stock market and the expectations are off the charts. Here, what you have is the actual stock market, the ruble declining, but not so fast, right? But the bottom is falling out. So this is kind of like a reverse bubble. It's not noticeable, right? Because you kind of see these stable, well, there's inflation, it's not 100%, it's only whatever, 13, 20. But then, but what's happening underneath, and that's what makes it very difficult to judge, is that the bottom is falling out. The problem with that, what happens to the bubbles, they all unravel very quickly.
So
as soon as the realization comes, and I honestly think they are on the verge of that.
Really? So I guess to summarize everything we've discussed, what is your bet? What's going to happen next? What can we expect to see in Russia in the coming days, weeks, or months?
I think I don't. Timing is always difficult, right? Timing is extremely difficult to predict, especially in a place that's very very deliberate in how they give information about their economy, and for obvious reasons. Part of the reason they are that deliberate is because they are afraid what that may lead to, and people running on the banks, withdrawing money, investors leaving, even though they're restricted from doing so, and
How
other
realistic?
consequences. I honestly,
How realistic is that we see something so end of the world apocalyptic where people are running to the banks and taking out money? And is that realistic? That's something, or there's hyperinflation, something like this? Is it possible?
I
Could it
think
really happen?
so. So I think that the uh, the government has shown, Russian government has shown that they do have knowledge, like what I mentioned, the patches that they're trying to apply that are very they're based on their understanding of how the market works. So my guess is that the more likely scenario is that their realization of this bottom falling down will reach the political decision makers, because let's face it, that's how those decisions are made, even though you might have actual economists who are implementing some of the decisions. And I'm you know I you know I actually I think I don't know if there's going to be a massive collapse if the the politics stays the course of this sort of authoritarian command economy. I am expecting, a precipitous drop. I don't know if it's going to be an overnight collapse, just because it is so tightly controlled. It's unprecedented what they can do in the economy that's, you know, until a few years back was sort of trending towards market reforms. And so the only thing that would prevent that is just that level of control of, quick limits, closing the banks, not allowing withdrawals, or limiting withdrawals for, to, 1,000 rubles a day or something like that. So that's the only reason that I'm saying is that that drop might be very difficult to observe, just because of such a strict control. And the Russian economy, if you think about this, it was open. It wasn't that open. So in other words, there is again, the housing, the energy, a lot of things were produced domestically, and those things will still be sort of chugging along, and and they have massive reserves that are getting smaller and smaller, but they still do. And so I don't see a big drop. But if the political situation changes, that might be completely different. Like, let me put it this way: if I was in Russia, I would be tempted to go and take my money out or transfer it somewhere, knowing what I know. It's probably very difficult to do, and there's not that many alternatives, and that might be the reason why a lot of people don't do it. And then also, I don't know. Frankly, I don't know how aware is the public of the general risks that the economy is facing.
That's fascinating. Well, listen, Professor, I appreciate your time today. Thank you for coming, and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!